Now let's look at learning objective C and D. We're going to state horizontal asymptotes in the domain and range. If we look at this, we have the exponential decay graph right here. The fill in the blank here, the graph falls from right to left. Remember, the domain for exponentials and for all graphs are the x values, and the range has everything to do with the y values. So let's look at 4 different examples where we graph them, state the asymptote, the domain, and the range. These 2 graphs right here, the first one, if you type into your calculator, you're going to have to be careful. You're going to type in the y equals part, you're going to do 3, and then I would just do the parentheses, do 1 divided by 2, the caret key to the x. And if you graph, zoom standard is the zoom button number 6 will give you a nice clean window from 10 to negative 10. Let's start then by just comparing these 2. Again, we can tell right here that this number that has the exponent to it is less than 1, so b is less than 1, therefore it's decay. And you can see in the graph as you read it from left to right, it is getting smaller. Similarly, on this second one here, be careful. The 2/3 is the number we're looking at because it has the exponent. That's our b value. Here, b is less than 1, so again, we know it's decay. And we can see that it is shrinking when we put it into the calculator. When you type the second one in the calculator, you would just type y equals. You're going to do 1 divided by 4. Do your open parenthesis 2 divided by 3 to the caret of x, and you should get the correct graph. The connection to make here is, if we look at the first graph, the rate of decay is 1/2. In the second graph, the rate of decay is at 2/3. 2/3 is a bigger number, and you can see that this graph right here actually is shrinking at a faster rate than this first graph. And you can compare the base number with the picture then. So looking at the domain, range, and asymptote for this graph, let's just talk about what you would type in the calculator. Be careful here at the y equals prompt. In parentheses, do 1 divided by 2, close it out, and then a caret key. And the exponent is all x minus 2, so you have to tell it to make that whole thing the exponent if you have the older calculators. If you do that, you'll get this graph. Let's first talk about the asymptote. Remember, the asymptote is a horizontal line that it approaches but doesn't cross. And you should be able to see it's right here. Just look and see at what number it crosses at. It crosses at 0, and it crosses the y-axis, so we say the asymptote is y equals 0. Let's talk range next. The range, remember, deals with the y's. The domain deals with the x's. Domain and range are alphabetical as x and y are. That's how I remember. If you look at the range down here, when the y's are -1, -2, -3, there's no graph. This is blank white space. This blue graph does not start being drawn until it crosses over 0. So the range is all the y's that are greater than 0. Right up in here, you see when we hit these y's, we start seeing graph activity. Now the domain for this one is the x's. If you take a look when x is here, we're on the graph. Here we have graph activity. At 2 we have graph activity. At 1 there's graph activity. At 0, at -1, at -2. The domain for all exponential functions, there's never a number that'll make it break. You can also tell in the picture, if you see a white spot or the graph breaks where it's blank, then they tried to put in an x value and couldn't get an answer. This is a smooth graph and all of the answers work. So the domain for this is the x's is all real numbers. I want to look at 4 examples of how to state the domain, range, and the asymptote. If we start with this first graph, again, let me show you what to type into your calculator. At the y equals prompt, you're going to do the open parenthesis like they do. 2 divided by 3 to the caret of x. Make sure now that you're going to type it and get out of the exponent and then type a +3. When you do that, you will get the graph that we see here at the right. Let's first look at that horizontal asymptote. If you draw a line here, you can see that the graph is approaching the horizontal line. It's crossing the y-axis at 3. And so we just write that as y is equal to 3 is the horizontal asymptote. Now remember domain and range. Range is the y values, domain is the x values. So as you look at the graph, on this first bottom half here, when the y's are -1, -2, -3, there's no graph. So there is no range for those y's or those negatives. When we hit a y of 0, there's still no graph. This graph does not start getting created until we pass the point of 3. So everything above the y's of 3 is when the blue graph starts getting drawn. That's the range. So we say the range, or the y's, are everything greater than 3. The asymptote, again, is an imaginary horizontal line that the graph approaches but never crosses, so it cannot equal 3 in this case. The domain, then, to wrap that up, it's the x values, and if you look at it, is their graph activity. When x is this value, we have part of the graph. When it's here, we do. You're going to notice for all these values of x, there's always some point showing up on the graph. The easiest way to explain domain is just to say the domain is always all real numbers except certain numbers. If there's a break in the graph where it's literally whited out, then you have an issue. This is a smooth graph with no breaks, so the domain, all real numbers work. And just type all reals. These next two, let's just talk about what you're going to type into the calculator. This first one here, you would type at the y equals prompt, again, 1 divided by 2 in parentheses. The caret, now in the old operating system, you have to put the x plus 3 all in parentheses because that's the entire little exponent. And when you graph that, you should get our blue graph here. For number 9, to put this one in the calculator, be careful at the y equals prompt. Do in parentheses 1 divided by 4, caret key x. That -2 has nothing to do with the x, so don't put it up there. So you would type it down below. And these are the two graphs. If you want to pause the video and see if you can identify for number 7 which one of these three is the asymptote, and for number 9 which is the asymptote, go ahead and do so. I'm now going to sketch the asymptote in here. For number 7, we can see the horizontal line is about right there. And for 9, the horizontal line is about right there. So if you look at the asymptote for number 7, it's crossing the y-axis at 0, so the asymptote is y equals 0. For number 9, it's crossing the y at -2, so the asymptote is y equals -2. Let's also state domain and range. Remember, the range is the y's. So as you look at this graph here, there's nothing for these negative y's. The y values on the graph, they don't start until beyond -2, so it's all the y's greater than -2. The range over here, again, we have no activity down here in the negative y's. Right above 0 is when the y's start showing up, so here we're going to say it's the y's greater than 0. The domain is the x values. Remember, domain and range are alphabetical. X is domain, range is y. The domain for all exponential functions, everything works. There's no number that will make this graph break and have breaks in it. So the domain is all real numbers. And I'm just going to piggyback and say that for both.